So I met most of you last night, but I want to welcome you now officially to John Jay College for the opening of our special seminar on rural injustice, a look at the jail crisis from the inside and from the outside. We're really pleased to have you here. We have an exciting lineup of speakers and a really compelling agenda. And as I was telling those of you here last night, the main aim of why we're here is to help the journalists who are here, the fellows who've been selected to come here, cover a crisis that, for the most part, is a hidden crisis, or has been a hidden crisis in the United States for quite a while. I mean, we know mass incarceration has been a problem, has been talked about by academics, by practitioners, by advocates for quite a while, but what hasn't really been talked about is one of the key drivers of mass incarceration, which is the jail population. Something like 11 million Americans a year cycle in and out of jails. Something like 60% of them have mental health issues. Large percentage, 2/3, are minority, black or Latino. And we know we have a problem, and the people who are dealing with it on the front lines are the people in your communities, the smaller towns across America, rural communities, where not a lot of attention has been drawn to it. And the issue is, how do you address it? Is it addressable by building more jails, by building better jails, by alternative options to jail? The main factors that drive it are complicated and complex, manyfold, as complex as our society. And we hope over the next 2 days we'll get some part of the way there towards understanding some of these factors, and we hope will help you drive even better stories and more evidence-based stories that, over the long run, will have an impact on policy change in your local areas and in the states. So my role here for the opening is really basically to welcome you and also to say a special thanks to the people who made this possible. The Ford Foundation and the MacArthur Safety and Justice Challenge helped us put this together. Their reps aren't here today. They'll be here tomorrow. I want to pay special heed to Al Cross, who just walked away. Oh, there he is. So Al Cross is a key partner in setting this up. He's the director of the Center for Rural Journalism and Community Issues at the University of Kentucky. He's one of the key folks in journalism today that actually works out in the hinterland, I hate to call it that, where a lot of you folks work and where a lot of the really good journalism is going on. People say that journalism is a dying profession, print journalism anyway, but I don't agree. We've had over nearly 1,000 fellows who passed through our programs over the last 8 to 10 years, and they all share the same enthusiasm and the same commitment, even at low pay and miserable hours, to tell really good stories and important stories to Americans. And you here are part of that, and we welcome you and wish you all the best for the next 2 days. I want to introduce for our first panel, Maurice Possley, who's your journalism coordinator. So Maurice can come up and we'll get our panelist speakers. I said a little bit about Maurice last night, but I'll give you now instead of the 10-cent version, the $1 version of his bio. He is a designated journalism coordinator. He won a Pulitzer Prize in 2008 for investigative reporting at the Chicago Tribune, where he had been a criminal justice reporter for over a quarter century. And he's been a 3-time Pulitzer Prize finalist for his justice reporting. He now is a senior researcher at the National Registry of Exonerations, which is a database of more than 2,000 wrongful convictions in the U.S. since 1989. And it's one of the great unsung NGOs around in this country to deal with wrongful convictions. He previously worked as a research fellow at Santa Clara University's Law School's Northern California Innocence Project. And he is a prolific author. He's a New York Times bestselling author and has 3 nonfiction books. You can read his full bio in your packages, but without further ado, let me introduce Maurice, and he can introduce our first panel.
Thank you. Will this work, or do I have to pull it right to the
should work.
I have to pull it right out.
You just pull it out. We're really high tech here.
There we go. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Why don't you all come on up here? I got our panel this morning is Cherise, Fanno, Burdeen from the Pretrial Justice Institute, Christian Henrichson from Vera, and Judge Stephen Leifman from Florida. And I'd like to, we're all kind of cozy.
Before you start, I forgot to add one thing, that everything, as you should already know, is on the record. We are taping it, so you will have tape recordings available online at some point after the conference. In case any of you are wondering, there is a Wi-Fi, and Ricardo can give you later the free Wi-Fi access. But it's the last bit of housekeeping I wanted to add.
As I mentioned last night, in picking or trying to get people to be panelists, I was kind of focused in two areas. One are people who are tremendous resources for data, who study the issue, who also know people within the community that studies this issue, and then people who are in the front lines who also personally experience some of these sheriffs and the like. These folks all deal with the data and with drilling down on why things are what they are, the state of things. And so from that perspective, I'd like to start with Christian, who can sort of talk about, in broad terms or in specific terms, where we are and what's going on here. Why are we at this, what does your data tell you? And what should we pick from this?
So if we're ready for me to do data, let me stand up. Is that all right?
Sure.
Great. So I have a deck of PowerPoint slides, and I don't have a clicker, so I'm going to have to ask to advance. So I appreciate if you could forgive me as we work through this. So I'm Chris Henrichson. I'm Research Director for Vera's Center on Sentencing and Corrections. It is a great pleasure to be here. I've been working on rural jails data for about 3 or so years now. You'll be meeting my colleagues, Jack Norton, who's an ethnographer and has done a lot of field research, and my colleague Nancy Fishman, who works with a lot of jails across the country to help them explore the jail population and explore solutions. I couldn't possibly think of a better audience to be in front of today. I'm very grateful to John Jay and to Maurice and to Steve and to Ford and MacArthur for funding this really terrific group, and really also to all of you. I know it's not easy to get away for 3 or 4 days in the summer to come to New York. Thank you so much. So we're going to do some next slide, please. So 2 top-line headlines that I'll be talking about as I go through a whole bunch of data. So the geography of incarceration has shifted dramatically. What you know coming here and what you've been told in your materials and maybe what you've seen on the ground is not widely known. And second, this has had profound implications on mass incarceration nationally. This is something else that I think is not appreciated very widely. You'll note at the footer, well, you probably can't see it. The footer of these slides directs you to tiny URL /rural-jails, where you can find this presentation and all the materials I'll speak about. So if you have a laptop on Wi-Fi, feel free to follow along or take a look later. So I know there's a lot of data, and you are more than welcome to take a look at it now or later. So next slide, please. I'm sure you're all very familiar with this chart. This is the rise of pretrial incarceration in the U.S. It's gone up about 4 times since the 1970s. It looks an awful lot like the very familiar rise of imprisonment in the United States. It's different, though, in that it's risen faster, and in the past couple decades, the rise of jail usage in America has been driven exclusively by pretrial detention, or those that are being held awaiting their trial. Next slide, please. It's really hard, or it's impossible, and misleading to talk about incarceration in America with a top-line U.S. number, particularly with jails. And I'll pause for a very brief definitional clarification that is surely not necessary, but just for these 2 days, jails are places where people were confined pre-trial or sentenced for generally less than 1 year, and prisons in general are places where people are sentenced to the state prison authority generally for a year or more. There are important exceptions and irregularities. Places like Pennsylvania and Louisiana call their jails prisons, and there's plenty of local jails that hold basically exclusively prisoners. But when I talk about jail stay, I'll be talking about those county and city-operated facilities that principally hold pretrial detainees. There's about 3,000 of these places in the United States because just about every county in the United States has a jail. So there's about 2,800 jail jurisdictions in the United States. And so when thinking about trends, you can't think about a top line. It's also kind of hard to imagine 2,800 trend lines. So we at Vera have been breaking down the geography of incarceration using 4 geographic dimensions. So next slide, please. So a lot of times when people look at America, they look at a map of states, and that's tempting in the context of criminal justice, given that state statute governs the laws that are enforced by the police and prosecutors. We think about geography a little bit differently. And this is because as looking through the trend lines for those 2,800 places, we've seen very discernible different trends in these different types of places. So I'll start first with why we're here today, which is the 1,900 rural counties. So the National Center for Health Statistics uses a taxonomy for county rural-urban classification that we at Vera have adopted. These are in the notes that the URL I have below, and you're more than welcome to take a look. Essentially, the 2 smallest classifications of counties, I think, one is micropolitan, and the other is non-core. We call those rural, and that's actually pretty conventional in social science to use those 2 smallest groups of the 6 from the National Center for Health Statistics to be classified as rural. That's about 1,900 of those dark red counties. Amongst those, particularly in the western states, you'll see those gray areas, which are small to mid-sized metropolitan counties. These are places that might be the largest cities in a western state, the state capitals. In the East Coast, it's a place like Albany or Scranton or Binghamton. These are the gray areas. These are certainly cities. They're maybe the biggest cities in those regions, but they are not amongst the largest cities in the U.S. There are 62 what we deem large urban areas, and these are places where the metropolitan area has 1 million or more people, and the blue county is that sort of core county. And surrounding that is the suburban area. So here, core counties are New York, and the suburbs are Westchester, Suffolk, Nassau, etc. So the next slide, please. Just to put a finer point on this, I'm zooming into the East Coast, just to put a finer point on, when I say large urban counties, I don't only mean Chicago and New York. I mean places like Oklahoma City and New Orleans, Louisville, Nashville, places that large media outlets sometimes don't talk a lot about. These are in this catchment of large metropolitan areas. And the trends in these places, whether the north, the south, east, or the west, actually look pretty similar. So next slide, please. So I'm going to continue to bury the lead here since everyone knows what the punchline is. But there's a reason why people have a misunderstanding about the way incarceration looks. It's because it hasn't always looked this way. So this trend line goes back to 1970, and I have it stopping at about 1998. And I know it's kind of hard to see, so I'll try to describe it. The top line is those large urban areas, the Nashvilles, the New Orleanses, the Houstons, the Bexar counties, these large metropolitan areas. And they've historically had incarceration rates in jails that are about twice that of every other place in America. And you'll see beneath that, pretty close together are trend lines for those suburban counties, small mid-metros, and rural. You can see in particular that the rural counties and suburban counties adjacent to large core, the dark green and the dark red, have followed nearly identical trajectories from 1970 to 1997. Above that is the small core area, or rather the small and mid-sized metros. You can also see that as time has gone on, these trend lines have inched closer and closer to large urban areas, but hadn't crossed by any means. Large core areas were by far the place with the largest jails. So take a look at this and think about what you know the prison trend line looks like, and you can imagine where you think these trend lines would go. The reasonable conclusion might be that, well, they'll all arc down just as the top line trend has, just as state prison populations have. If you advance to the next slide, you'll see that that's clearly what has not happened. So suburban counties have taken on the trajectory that we might expect, and there's really 2 very remarkable things in this chart. The first is something we're not going to talk a lot about today in the next 2 days, is the trajectory of urban places, which the growth stopped about in the late 1990s, leveled out, and then around 2008 began to fall precipitously. This chart ends at 2013 because that's where the good BJS data ends. And we know from headlines across the country, whether in Philadelphia or Oklahoma City or New York, that large urban populations in jails are falling precipitously fast, even beyond this trend line. Suburban areas take a similar trajectory, but the reason we're here today is to talk about the remarkable increase of rural jails since the late 1990s. That's been mirrored to a large extent by the growth in small and mid-sized metropolitan areas, small and mid-sized cities, but at least even in those places, they've leveled off and begin to decline a bit, at least as of 2013. Growth in rural places continues unabated, and from newspaper headlines, at least I'm seeing, places in rural counties are breaking ground on a new jail. This doesn't seem to be problematized as an issue, but it's clearly bucking the national trend. Next slide, please. So rural counties are small, so many of you are probably thinking, well, this is all interesting, but aren't you kind of putting your thumb on the scale by talking about this in terms of rates? Rural counties are small, so how much can this really mean nationally? Is this really a national story? So let's take a look at the data. So next slide, please. So here you have a pie chart of the incarcerated population in jails, and you can see that half of them are in those large urban counties, about 62, and about equal slivers in the rest of the country. Next slide, please. The thing is, that's 1970, and it's changed considerably since then. So could you advance to the next slide? Next. 1990. Next, please, 2000. Next, 2010, and stop on 2015. And you can see that where we are today is that we talk an awful lot about large urban jails, and we should be. There's about 186,000 people in large urban jails. There's also 143,000 people in rural jails. In fact, there's as many people in rural jails today as there were in about all jails in 1970. An important story that we're not going to talk a lot about today, but I think merits discussion, whether in future panels or in your own reporting, is where the engine of mass incarceration really is today in many ways is these small and mid-sized places, these places shaded gray, the 236,000 people that we're not going to talk about today. They may be the largest cities in the states that are very rural, and they seem to be following a similar trend, but they do seem to be stopping the growth where rural counties do not seem to be stopping the growth. So next slide, please. So some of you may be thinking, well, this is clearly quite dramatic. This must also be because there's more people today in smaller counties than there were in the past. So let's take a look at the next slide. So this is the US population in 1970. You can see that there was probably about a third in large urban counties and maybe less than a quarter in rural areas. So let's take a look at it today in the next slide. It's pretty much identical. So although the national population has grown by more than 100 million since 1970, the shares of the distribution of that population is pretty similar. In fact, both urban areas and rural areas comprise a slightly smaller proportion of the US population, but that's not what's driving this. It's really the rates. Next slide, please. So how does this affect trends? We've only talked about top lines. So it affects trends in a number of very important ways when it comes to the demography of who is in jail. So next slide. So the growth of women behind bars has become a story that's now being told as it should be. There are now 14 times more women in jail today than there were in 1970. There's been a lot of discussion of the conditions of confinement of women held in prisons in particular. There's actually proportionally more women in jails than there are in prisons, and even higher proportions of jail admissions are women than of those residing in jail. A lot of women cycle in and out of jail at a higher rate than men. This is largely driven by small and rural places. This is not a phenomenon that you see in big cities. It's much more acute in small and rural places. Next slide. There's also been discussion in the national media about the changing racial composition of the U.S. prison population, and the U.S. jail population has taken on a similar trend. So there's actually a decreasing number of African Americans in both prisons and jails at the top line. But let's take a look at the geographic dimension to this here. So next slide. So this is a trend that persists in every region, north, south, and east. There's a bit of an asterisk on west. You can see that it's picked up a little bit, but that's really exclusively driven by realignment in California that reclassified certain crimes to be held in jails rather than prisons. That increase is actually a little bit artificial. So let's take a look at the geographic trends on urban-rural. Next slide. And you can see that the decline in black incarceration has been the steepest in large metros, and growth has not abated in rural counties. So on the next slide, there's been discussion about increasing rates of white incarceration. So this is the top line. White incarceration in jails has increased 88% since 1990. So next slide, please. You can see that this is a phenomenon that we're seeing in all regions of the country. It's growing maybe the steepest in the South. Let's take a look at the next slide where you see the real dimension of change. So it's in rural areas, again, in small, mid-sized metros where you see the highest growth. And at least in recent years, you see declines in the white jail population in large cities and their surrounding suburbs. So next slide. So this is not to say that there is no longer racial disparity. There are still great stark racial disparities in jails and in prisons. They've declined slightly to 3.6, so 3 points on a proportional basis. Black Americans are jailed at 3.6 times the rate of white Americans. I do want to drop an important caveat here for those that are reporting on disparities. There are problems with the data by race that's collected by BJS that are well acknowledged, and we write about in the reports that I linked to. Specifically that Latino Americans seem to be systemically undercounted in jails and prisons and are misreported as whites. So while it's quite clear that the black population in jails and prisons is declining, whether or not the increase is white Americans or Latino Americans is actually an open question at the top line aggregate level and really merits in-depth investigation at the local level to figure out what's happening. So you can take a look at a report on that I've linked to for more details. I just want to put out that very important caveat when reporting on disparities. Next slide. So what about prisons? We're not talking about prisons today, but I think it's important to at least drop a note to reference a recent Vera report. So the next slide. Basically, we see the similar trends, not quite as acute as we see with jails, but it's really the rural and smaller counties that are driving prison admissions. This has really been a story in New York State. It's not just New York City that's been downsizing the number of people sent to prison, but also Rochester and Buffalo, while the rest of the state is sending more and more. And we see similar trends in even Louisiana. New Orleans is sending fewer to prison. The rest of the state is sending more. Illinois and Colorado follow similar trajectories. If you're interested in your state, we have a new report called The New Dynamics of Mass Incarceration. That's, again, linked in the materials. And there's an appendix table, I think table 3, that shows the detail for all the states for which data is available. So next slide. So what is driving this? I'm not going to talk a lot about our thoughts on this. My colleagues will talk more about this later on in the session today, and I'm sure my panelists will also. But I do want to highlight some recent polling we did, because a knee-jerk reaction, particularly those that work and live in big cities, is that, well, maybe this is about punitiveness and attitudes about crime and punishment. So let's take a look at some results to a recent poll. On the next slide. Next, please. One more, please. So we did a poll with Greenland Quizner Rosner Research, GQRR. And we oversampled rural counties to get statistically significant, be able to test for statistical significance. So we surveyed 1,000 people by phone in rural counties and fewer in urban and small cities. And asked them a whole battery of questions, but one of them is are incarceration rates too high? And 45% of people in rural area or urban areas said yes, only 30% in rural areas. So this could have two dimensions. One could be it's either not perceived to be a problem, meaning that they don't think the rates are not high and they are indifferent to its highness, or they're just not high. I think it's interesting to contrast this with the next question, if you advance 2 clicks, that I would be concerned if I knew that my incarceration rate were higher than others. So 70% of people in urban areas say, yes, I would be concerned about that. Interestingly, so does 60% of people in rural areas. And I think it's worth reflecting on how in the early 2000s, mass incarceration was largely problematized as a urban phenomenon. There's been lots of terrific work done on what were deemed $1 million blocks, those places in large cities that sent so many people to prison that the state literally spent millions per year to incarcerate people from just a single city block. and justice reinvestment that took the philosophy of we need to downsize our prisons and take these funds and reinvest them into community. There's a lot of thought and leadership in the early 2000s that was really the driving force behind a lot of the reforms we saw in the past 10 years. We did not see incarceration framed as a problem in rural America at the beginning of this movement in the early 2000s. So I think it's worth thinking about how the extent to which this is happening is driven by a lack of awareness. It's very hard for a jail that's only 100 or 200 beds to seem like a problem of national significance or a contributor to mass incarceration. But when you add those up 1,900 times, they are. The reality is that in the past couple of decades, mass incarceration has metastasized from its largest cities to really almost every community in America. So next slide. Since we have a group of local journalists who will be doing locally oriented reporting, I want to emphasize another very important fact that local conditions are not necessarily their average. I've been talking just about averages right now. So next slide. So this is a histogram, and it shows the pretrial incarceration rate in 1970, and it's binned out from the first tall bar is 0 to 100 per 100,000 capita in jail. Then the next bar is 200 to 300, then 300 to 400. It sort of bins out the incarceration rates. And you can see that the most common incarceration rate in the 1970s or 1970 was 1 to 99 per 100,000, followed by 100 to 200,000. And then that was kind of where it capped out. And for reference, today the average is about 250. If you advance through the next slides on 2 or 3 or 4 clicks, we'll go to 1980. Then 1990, 2000, and you can see that this tall bar has kind of fallen over. And the average pretrial incarceration rate today is about 250 per 100,000 per capita, which is sort of that second bar. But you can see that there's, and it's hard to tell if you're in the back of the room, but there's hundreds of counties, rural counties, that have rates that are 2, 3, 4, or 5 times the national average. That said, there's also plenty of counties that are below the national average. So it's really hard to paint with a broad brush when talking about rural places. So that leads to the next question on the next slide. So one more, please. Where can I get my county's data? This data is sourced from the federal government, from BJS. If you go to the next slide, we've put this all online for each individual county at trends.vera.org. And so this is a heat map that shows jail incarceration rates. And if you click to the next slide, you can see a detail for an example county, which is where we are today, New York City. And you can explore the trend line and compare it to the state average and national averages over time. New York City's had quite a bit of decline in the past couple of decades. And that's it. It's been just a great pleasure to speak with you. My contact information is in the last slide, and I look forward to your questions and comments.
Thank you. Cherise, I first met Cherise, I guess 7 years ago. John Jay did a similar program devoted entirely to pretrial detention. And I'm interested to hear what you can tell us that I didn't know from back then, and the arc of time. You have your finger on this like no one else in the country through the Pretrial Justice Institute.
Great, thanks. Good morning. I also have a PowerPoint, lights dim, clicker advancing. Thank you. So I am really grateful not only to be here, but to Vera for the work that they've done essentially populating and analyzing data that, while it may not be as awesome as we wish it were, it's amazing, and what they've been able to do with it makes your job a job that couldn't have been done in 2011 when we did this symposium for the first set of reporters. My job today is to give you a bit more context as to why, from our point at the Pretrial Justice Institute, the reflection in the data that Chris presented is there. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the pretrial improvements and the national landscape. And I'm not going to talk, I will refer to a few national averages, but really what I want to focus on is encouraging you to develop a set of really deep inquiries about why things are the way they are, where you'll be reporting. So next slide, please. So just to, before I even do this, I just want to say that really the very simple question that was posed at the head of this section, and the very simple answer, why do we see a rise in jail populations? Jail populations are a function of two things, and really two things only: the number of people going in and how long they stay. And so what we've seen in the reflection of the data that Chris presented is we've seen a huge influx in the number of people arrested and put into jails in the country, and we've seen them not be able to get out. So it's really, unfortunately, not much more complicated than that. Now, the reasons behind the why we're arresting more people, much complicated. You should figure that out in your jurisdiction. What are the arrest policies? What are the crime problems? What are the social justice issues going on in your jurisdiction? And then the answer to the question, why are they staying there that long? Don't worry, I have the answer. It's very simple. Money bond. So I'm going to talk to you about that. This is the purpose of the bail decision. I also want to say we have resources that are available to you. In 20 minutes, I'm not going to give you the history of bail in America. I'm not going to give you your Pretrial Justice 101 course. All of those things are actually available for free on our University of Pretrial website. So university.pretrial.org. It's free. You go on, you register, you get a profile, and there's something called Pretrial Justice in 60 minutes. If you fast forward, you can get through it on that high-speed dub sound in about 40 minutes. We sound like we've taken helium if you do it that way. This is the main purpose of the bail decision. The courts have ruled that when someone comes before a judge or a magistrate, they're supposed to be considering three things. The bail decision is to provide due process to the people who've been arrested. It's to maintain the integrity of the judicial system. That means things like protecting of witnesses and victims, and also making sure people show up for court. And so these are the three things that a court is supposed to be considering, the system is supposed to be considering as the purpose of the bail decision. What you don't see up there are things like, make sure we get our pound of flesh now because you can't count on the rest of the court system to provide that certainty of conviction. It doesn't say things like, well, we don't really like a particular kind of crime in this neighborhood, and so we're going to over-incarcerate for that and under-incarcerate for other things. There's supposed to be some actual fairness associated with this process. Next slide. There are only two Supreme Court, everyone's talking about the Supreme Court these days. There are only two Supreme Court cases that really, and a slight third, that have to do with bail over the last 100 years. The first one was actually back in like 1956, 1957. It was Stack versus Boyle. Stack versus Boyle said, hey, guess what? Americans have the right to an individualized bail determination, meaning if Fiona and I are arrested for the same thing, but we have different backgrounds, we actually should have those backgrounds considered. If she is a multiple, long-term, criminally involved person, and this is my first offense, and I was actually just riding in the car with her, she's a very bad influence on me, we shouldn't actually be treated the same. The Bill of Rights entitles us to be treated individualized. And then in 87, Salerno ruled that essentially not only could appearance in court, many people don't know this, but prior to 87, the only thing that courts could consider was appearance in court as the reason for determining what your bail conditions would be. It wasn't until 87 in which the Supreme Court also said that public safety or community safety was now also a legitimate thing that a judge could consider when making a bail determination. But Rehnquist, not really the most liberal justice we've ever had, said, but don't forget, liberty should be the norm and detention the carefully guarded exception. And what Chris's data shows you is that most of the country went, nah, we're not going to do that. So keep going. Next slide. So we are required by law to maximize these three things at the same time. And if you can imagine, it is a balancing act, right? We are asking the system to do something that considers essentially what could be considered two almost in paradox or contradictory notions. How do we maximize liberty while also maximizing the outcomes we're supposed to be maximizing? Next slide. So I'm going to talk to you about how places make that decision, and these are questions you should go home and ask of your local system. And let me just tell you, anyone here will tell you, all your panelists will tell you, you have to ask that question of multiple people in your jurisdiction. If you ask one person, how are bail decisions made in this jurisdiction, you will get one answer from their point of view. It may even be distant from the actual first arraignment or first appearance court. Watch court. How many people have actually sat through bail hearings? Excellent. What you'll notice is great variation, right? Variation from judge to judge, from day of the week, from even great variation from what the written policy is to what's actually happening in practices. But most people, here's how they do it. You get arrested. You get booked into a jail. That's also a major difference that we have today, is that for almost every charge for which you can be arrested, you get booked into a jail in this country. And so what happens after you get booked into a jail is someone alerts you to the dollar amount associated with your freedom. That is either done by a money bond right there at the jail, or it is done, or at the police precinct, wherever the holding facility is. It's either set by an actual schedule, or on that schedule there's a bit of a range. If you don't make that bond amount at that particular time, you then go to your first appearance hearing, and at that the judge will either carry forward, and we have studies that show for the most part those bond amounts that are set by schedule are carried forward by judges at first appearance, or based on some mitigating or aggravating factors that will go up or go down at the bail setting hearing, at the first appearance. Some places have pretrial assessments, formerly known as pretrial risk assessment. Last year, we dropped the word risk from our nomenclature because we are not actually predicting a lot of risk. These are rare events. Most people show up for, this is sort of the other dirty secret that the bondsman won't tell you. Most people show up for court, and they do so arrest-free. That's just the truth of the matter. And so pretrial assessments are trying to help determine really what conditions should be set in order to improve the likelihood of appearance and public safety. But they're not really good predictors of something that's considered in statistics a rare event. So some places do use pretrial assessments, and if you work in a jurisdiction that is touting the fact that they have a pretrial assessment, you need to ask the question, what do you do with that outcome of that score? Because if they simply move from that assessment over to a bond schedule or over to a set of dollar amounts and say, well, Chris, you scored a 1 on a scale of 1 to 5, so your bond is $500. If Chris doesn't have that money to get out, big deal. We know he's a 1. He's still going to be incarcerated for the duration until he takes a plea. Use of supervision conditions. So in your jurisdictions, and this is another thing that will come up as you report on pretrial reform or improvements in your jurisdictions, if those are underway, is many rural jurisdictions will say, or small jurisdictions will say, well, we can't afford to do pretrial work because we don't have pretrial services agency, or we don't have pretrial supervision. Nobody in this country lives in a jurisdiction in which someone isn't sentenced to probation. So if you have probation assets, if people are on community-based supervision in your jurisdictions, they actually do have a mechanism through which they could provide court reminders, as well as people just being able to touch base, which is the most common condition, is a call-in or a visit to some supervising agency. But there's a lot of problems with supervision conditions, and I don't have time today, but hopefully over the next 2 days and in our relationship with you over the course of your fellowship, we'll help you understand that supervision conditions, we are at grave danger in this country of this pretrial justice reform, which I've now worked on for a decade, but people have been working on for 5 or 6 decades, is going to simply move from jail incarceration to home incarceration in some way. Community-based incarceration, where people are on overuse of electronic monitoring, overuse of pretrial conditions of supervision, including things like alcohol patches, drug monitoring, all sorts of things that research actually shows if you over-condition low-risk people, you will cause technical violations. You are forcing people to choose between complying with your conditions or staying employed at their jobs, caring for their children or elderly or sick family members or friends. And often these conditions are used in combination with money bond. Or they're fee-based, which is a whole other discussion we can get into at another time. And this is a very, something that is more likely to be seen in smaller communities than larger communities that can afford the vendor fees for supervision conditions. Often in smaller places, they try to pass those costs off to the folks who've been arrested. And including in some of your jurisdictions where when you check out of the jail, just like I'll check out of my hotel tomorrow, you're given a bill associated with your stay. So these are questions you should find out about in your jurisdiction. Next slide, please. So what are the results of this very, very common practice of setting money bond? As I said, in addition to the fact that incarceration is now, 9 times out of 10, it is the result of your interaction with law enforcement. You don't get issued a lot of citations in the US. You get booked into a jail. The other thing is, if we're setting money bond on almost everybody, we used to set a lot of money bond on felonies, not so much on misdemeanors. And I think if you go back into some historical trends in your jurisdiction, I would look to see what has been the trend of our use of money bond in our jurisdiction. And if you pan out wide enough, you're likely to see that over the last several decades, almost every charge for which you can be booked into a jail in your communities, a money bond now is associated with that. It shows you the great lobbying power of the commercial surety industry, which I wish was a whole other panel here, and I'm happy to talk about. It's one of my favorite subjects. For those of you who've interviewed me, you know I like to talk about the bondsman. The results of these practices of setting money bond, of incarcerating people, are the following, and some Chris mentioned, in addition to you can advance to the next slide, in addition to a growth in the jail population in the country, and most of that being in the pretrial context. Next slide. One of the statistics that we love, you'll see a slight variation in these numbers, but we're all up around the same thing, is that almost all of the jail growth in the United States since the year 2000 has been in pretrial detention. And the vast majority of those people have money bonds that they are not able to meet. Next slide. This isn't being shared among all race or ethnicities. We're seeing a huge disparity, not just in arrest and jail populations, but also the setting of bond and the likelihood of making it. So if you're a person of color, you're more likely, for the same offense that your white counterpart is being charged with, you're more likely to have a high bond amount than your white counterpart, and you are less likely to be able to make that bond amount. One of the other things you might want to take a look at in your jurisdiction is where is the concentrated extraction of money bond. So it's not a rural jurisdiction, but in Baltimore, for example, the 3 poorest or 4 poorest zip codes within or neighborhoods within Baltimore make up 50, 60, 70, 80% of the bonds being paid, the premiums being paid to bondsmen. And we're talking in the millions and millions and millions and millions of dollars. That is money that may not be given over immediately. So if I have a $10,000 bond set and I owe 10% to a bondsman, I may not be able to write a check for $1,000, but now you have me on paper. And so I'll give you $10 today and you'll put me on a payment plan. And so it is the extraction of that wealth over time. People are entering into loan agreements from the poorest neighborhoods in the country and on paper to bondsmen for well long after they have satisfied their debt to the court. Next slide. So it's not being felt, this is like PowerPoint 101, don't do. Right? Here's 30,000 words on a thing. But you can have this slide deck, and I was just trying to get it all in. So there's a lot of outcomes. I'm not going to read them. You can read. But we are actually, as my mother used to say, sort of biting off our nose to spite our face. We are doing things at the front end of the system that are actually being done or said they're being done in the name of public safety or in the name of victims, and what they're actually doing is causing poor outcomes for those very individuals. High-risk people who are very likely to commit a violent act if they get out of jail pre-trial, jail does nothing to them. It doesn't make them worse. You go in sick, you come out sick. You go in as a high-risk person, you come out as a high-risk person. What we're doing is taking people who are at low risk of failing to appear or being rearrested, and through the process itself, we are actually making it more likely in the future. And we have all sorts of citations for that research. So you're more likely to get a bad outcome as an individual, but you're also more likely to fail to appear or commit another offense or be rearrested in the future. The irony of all of this, and the reason why I'm so passionate about this topic, is that it doesn't have to be this way, and it's actually one of the easiest criminal justice problems to solve. Sentencing reform, tough. Exonerations, tough. trying to get the system to reverse an action or change the way they do things is really, really tough. But if you want to have the biggest impact in the shortest amount of time, you change your bail practices. And we have lots of case studies. Yakima County, anybody here from Washington State? Yakima County, Washington just finished a 3-year smart pretrial initiative and in fact showed that in a small rural jurisdiction, you can have great results in a quick amount of time. It's going to save the jurisdiction money, it's going to improve outcomes, and it's going to improve quality of life for everybody. People released without money bond do just as well as people who are released on money bond. Said the other way, people released on money bond, there's no discernible positive impact. And in fact, the setting of money bond has nearly one or two outcomes only. It detains people who are too poor to post that bond, and it lets bad guys who can afford to post bond get out without being assessed or having conditions that would improve public safety. You're going to hear from Sheriff Taylor at some point today. He's from Colorado. Hello, Kirk. Nice to see you. A couple of years ago, a state trooper was shot by a guy out on money bond, and it was a big deal in Colorado. It's a big deal for officer safety all across the country, and so it's something to look at. And in fact, in many jurisdictions, if you look to see some of the biggest problems that we have in terms of people being released in a way that we hadn't hoped they were released, which is with no supervision, money bond is almost always the culprit. And I like to say that as a bondswoman, I would rather write one bond for $1 million than have to scramble and write thousands of bonds for 10 or 15 bucks a piece. So if you're charged with a violent offense and you're set with a high bond, you're like my prime target. You're the Lamborghini I want to sell this year to make my commission, rather than trying to sell, several thousand Honda Civics. Next slide. So if you wanted to look at some studies about sort of confirming the fact that we get bad outcomes when money bond is used, there's lots of things, and I have the citations in the notes section. Next slide. Next slide. Problems at both ends. So when I talk about pretrial justice work, I want to also alert you to the fact we're not just talking about the bail decision. Bail, by the way, is not the same word as money bond. Bail, we're not eliminating bail in the U.S. Eliminating bail in the U.S. would mean no one got out pretrial ever. Bail are the conditions that the court releases you under. Money bond is one of those conditions. So the Eighth Amendment, no probably budding lawyers in the room, Eighth Amendment, prohibition against excessive bail, I'm happy to talk to you about that. It doesn't mean you have the right to a bond amount you can meet. So when we talk about pretrial improvements, we're actually talking about looking at your local jurisdictions to say, how do we reduce the flow of people into the jail, and how do we make sure they don't stay there longer than they need to? And so there are lots of ways to do that. Many jurisdictions are expanding the use of citations in lieu of arrest. We're talking about resetting this default, and we have public opinion polling coming out later this week that talks about the country's interest in resetting this default of incarceration. We're talking about working to remove or eliminate monetary conditions, but we're also talking about things like, are your public defenders actually at the hearings at which someone's liberty is at stake? 2008 Supreme Court case, Rothgary versus Gillespie. Take a look at it. Many jurisdictions are moving in the direction of making sure, because we know, it shouldn't really shock you, having an attorney with you at the hearing in which your liberty is at discussion actually improves the outcome of those hearings. Or prosecutors. When are prosecutors reviewing these cases, either for a reduction in charges, because the police may have overcharged or there just isn't the evidence to support that probable cause claim, or, and you're going to hear from just an amazing guy who's going to talk about mental health and the work that he does down in Florida, or are people eligible for referral to specialty courts, problem-solving courts, veteran court, mental health, domestic violence, anything? Is the prosecutor looking at that within the first couple of days, or are they looking at it 30, 60, 90 days later? After someone has spent a long time in pretrial incarceration. So it's about really refocusing the limited resources we have to this early decision, because if I'm charged with something, that's what my bond is set on. If a month later the prosecutor reduces those charges, it's like paying for a Bentley but driving off the lot in a Chevy. Lucas County is here. They can talk about their work on technical violations. So there's a lot of things. And the one thing most jurisdictions don't have, which is a lawful way to detain. Why are courts setting $1 million bonds on the scariest of the guys? Because they don't actually have a protocol called preventive detention. And if you write about DC or you write about what's going on in New Jersey, or New Mexico, it's the preventive detention protocol that actually allows the courts to find the needle in a haystack, detain those people pending trial, and then everybody else. Our goal at PJI is to get this country under 10% pretrial detention. It's doable. In DC, which has had pretrial reform for 2 or 3 decades, they're around 10%. New Jersey, which is in the budding stages of pretrial reform, they're at about 12% detention right now. They're going to get well under 10. So it is doable, and it's not where we're at today. Next slide. So, next slide. Next slide. Last thing I want to leave you with, and you can just click through these. The last thing I want to leave you with is this is a movement that's happening across the country. It sort of started around 2011, and we're really just picking up steam. We've gone from almost no investments in pretrial justice research, data, improvements, site work, nothing, to millions and millions and millions and millions of dollars being invested in changing the way we think about and use jails. You can let MacArthur know I gave that plug. We have litigation, so if many of the litigation wins that are happening in small jurisdictions across the country, although Harris County, Texas, and San Francisco are 2 really big cases, and we also just had a great ruling out of New Jersey yesterday, which may or may not be out in public yet. Great litigation happening across the country. And we're seeing a lot of investment in this area. So it's the right time to write about these stories. And the last thing, I don't even know what my last slides are, but I'm going to wrap up. You can just keep going behind me while I do. That should have been my last slide, and then a resources slide. We publish a couple of things that should be, I hope, helpful to you. A quarterly thing called Where Pretrial Improvements Are Happening. It's about 30 pages that just is a compendium of everything that's happening in the country, and we update it quarterly. And we also have some other kind of 2-pagers on costs, on assessment tools, on all that kind of stuff. But the last thing I want to leave you with is this. We wouldn't be here today if it wasn't for a journalist. Laura Sullivan, 2009, 2010, NPR 3-part series. It wasn't until that moment in time when she released that, and she won a Peabody for that. It wasn't until a journalist put this story on the map in a way that was understandable to readers and listeners that we saw any shift from funders, from the government, from stakeholder groups, from anything, to actually begin to recognize that if you want to talk about ending mass incarceration or changing the trajectory of mass incarceration in this country, it's not just focusing on jails. It's focusing on pretrial detention. And so I'm really grateful to all the reporters. You're sort of the folks who are making this happen, and we need you to keep at it. Okay, super last thing I'll say. I really hate everything the bondsmen do, but the one thing they're doing that I actually hate, and I love to hate it, is that they are focusing on the investment by MacArthur in jurisdictions across the country and asking, they're twisting the view. Oh, $3 million has been spent in this jurisdiction, and look, the jail population has gone up. Transparency about this system and about the data and about the decisions, and you're going to meet stakeholders in this room. Judge Zamuda is one of my favorites, who as a system stakeholder is standing up saying, hold me accountable for the oath of office I took, for the work that I'm doing, and don't let this system go unnoticed anymore. And to the extent that journalists can raise up and profile system stakeholders like Judge Leifman and Judge Zamuda and many other, and Prosecutor Krasner, who you're going to hear from, who are saying this is what we've been doing is crap, it's produced the wrong outcomes, and we should be held accountable for that work. This is an important moment in time, and I'm really grateful you're going to write stories about it. Thanks.
Thank you. When I worked at the Tribune on investigative projects team, every year in December or early January, we would have a meeting and everyone would propose their pet projects that they wanted to get approval to do in the coming year. And it seemed like every year one of the sort of evergreens that was never given the green light was, why is Cook County Jail the largest mental health institution in the state of Illinois? And part of, I think, the issue was no one could quite figure out how to get into it and report it in a meaningful way. Last night at our reception, a number of you mentioned that this is an issue that you want to address, deal with, report on, which is the issue of jails being as a place for holding people with mental health issues. And Judge Leifman is, you can't find a better person to talk to and hear from, who has done amazing work in this area.
Great. Thank you so much. Good morning. My name is Steve Leifman. I am a judge from Miami-Dade County, the largest rural community in Florida. Just kidding. But we are a microcosm of a much bigger issue. But before I get into my formal presentation, I definitely want to thank John Jay and Maurice and Ford and MacArthur for sponsoring this amazing event. But more importantly, I really want to thank all of you. You give voice to the voiceless, and you provide a nation that is desperate and hungry for real information and real news, what they need to hear even when they don't necessarily want to hear it. So I have tremendous and deep respect for the work that you do. In fact, I didn't have enough time to show it, but maybe if we do later, a local CBS 4 affiliate in Miami did 17 stories on this particular topic. It was so impactful that not only did she win 6 or 7 Emmys for her work because she did it over a year's period, it totally changed the trajectory of our issue in our community by impaneling a grand jury in our community to look at this issue and basically indict the entire system for the cruelty that we had perpetrated on a population that is just very, very sick. And so, but for journalism, I probably wouldn't be here today talking to you about the amazing outcomes that we have, in fact, had. I will tell you that when I became a judge, I had no idea I was actually becoming the gatekeeper to the largest psychiatric facility in the state of Florida. And while Cook County may be the largest psychiatric facility in Illinois, the Miami-Dade County was by far the largest psychiatric warehouse, facility's too nice of a word, in our state. You know, while the United States, thank you, has 5% of the world's population, we have 25% of the world's inmates. Think about it. 1 out of 4 inmates in the world are housed in the United States in jails. As we sit here this morning, 1 out of 104 adults in the United States are behind bars. 1 out of 33 adults in the United States are under correctional supervision. Since 1980, the number of people going to jail in this country has tripled, and their sentences have increased by 166%. And if you peel back the onion and you try to figure out what in the heck is going on, what you're going to find is most of this is due to untreated mental illness and substance use disorders. In fact, people in the United States with mental illnesses are 9 times more likely to be incarcerated than hospitalized. They're 18 times more likely to find a bed in the criminal justice system than at any state civil hospital. Annually, we have about 2 million people with serious mental illnesses arrested, and on any given day in the United States, there are about 550,000 people with serious mental illnesses in jails and prisons, and another 900,000 under correctional supervision. 40% of all people with a serious mental illness in this country at some point in their life will come into contact with the criminal justice system. And when I talk about serious mental illness, I'm not talking about people who were depressed because they got arrested. I'm talking about people with a diagnosable organic illness such as schizophrenia, bipolar, major depression, or PTSD. This is a horrible, horrible, shameful American tragedy, and it's one that can and must be reversed. And if you break down the numbers, what you will find is about 17% of a jail or prison population has a very serious mental illness. Interestingly, and corresponding to the original data that you saw earlier, 33%, there's a much larger overrepresentation of women in jail with mental illnesses than men. 33% of all women in jail in the United States or prison have a very serious mental illness, and about 14% of men have a very serious mental illness. Most of this is due to very serious trauma. In fact, about 92% of all the women in jail and prison in the United States with a serious mental illness were sexually abused as children. It usually happens when they're 6, 7, or 8 years old. Trauma, I have to tell you, is physiological. It's not an emotional response. So you have this little thing in your body called the pituitary gland. You're like, why is the judge talking to me about my pituitary gland? Because it's very, very important, and it's one of the main drivers of criminal activity that we are just starting to understand. So this little pituitary gland is kind of your warning system, and it works faster than all the computers that you have at your desk. And so if you're 6, 7, or 8 years old and you're getting sexually abused at home, because most of this is familiar, it's not stranger, the pituitary sends a little message to the adrenal, and the adrenaline releases a chemical called cortisol, and the cortisol goes to the brain. It's your flight or fight mechanism. And if you cannot escape the trauma, the cortisol continues to produce and hit the brain pretty hard, and it overdoses the brain, and it permanently alters brain activity, and this is what causes PTSD. But what happens is the mom usually turns a blind eye because the perpetrator often is a breadwinner. Sometimes it's the father, the boyfriend, the stepfather, and so it goes on for long periods of time. The child usually is afraid to tell anybody, so they don't. They start to act out in school. The schools do not wrap their arms around the child to find out why they're behaving the way they are. They're removed from the class, put into a class with other bad kids, and finally, when the creep stops, or the child gets old enough to get away from the situation, they now have a very severe case of PTSD. And the symptoms of those illnesses are really rough. It could be anything from hearing voices to schizoaffective type disorder, and so they begin to self-medicate themselves, often with drugs, to deal with the symptoms of not being able to sleep. Eventually they run away, eventually they turn to prostitution to pay for their drugs, and eventually they end up into the criminal justice system when they were victims at 6, 7, or 8 years old. This is our criminal justice system today. Our counties now spend about $80 billion a year on correctional costs. It is getting so bad that counties are now having to decide, particularly in rural communities like yours, do I build a new road or a new jail? Do I build a new school or a new jail? Do I build a new hospital or a new jail? Or do I do infrastructure or a new jail? In fact, I was out in Arizona recently, and in Flagstaff, that county was spending almost 50% of their entire budget on correctional costs in their community. Our states are spending $71 billion for prison costs. In my own state, the number of people with serious mental illnesses is exploding in our prison system. And so while our prison system has basically leveled off in growth, the people with mental illnesses are continually growing at a very, very high rate. In fact, it's growing so fast in Florida that if we don't do something on a massive scale to stop this growth, Florida's going to need to build 10 new prisons over the next 10 years just for its mental health population. Now, they're not committing heinous offenses. In fact, the average stay for most people with a mental illness in prison is only 2.5 to 4 years. They just accumulate a lot of points because they pick up a lot of junkie-type quality of life offenses and eventually end up in the prison system. Well, if you build 10 prisons in Florida and operate them over 10 years, the cost is about $2.5 billion. Think about it. There's something very wrong with a society that is willing to spend more money to incarcerate people who are ill than to treat them. If my state took a fraction of that kind of money and fixed its community mental health system, most of these people would stay out of the system to begin with. Just a few facts about people with mental illnesses, because there's a lot of stigma and a lot of misunderstanding. One thing you need to understand is that most people, well, I should say this, people with mental illnesses are no more dangerous than people without a serious mental illness. In fact, they're much more likely to be victims of violent crimes than perpetrators of violent crimes. And on medication, people with serious mental illnesses are actually much less dangerous than the general population. And recovery rates for people with serious mental illnesses are actually better than for people with heart disease and diabetes. I became very involved in this issue in the year 2000. I had a very serious case in my courtroom where the defendant was a Harvard-educated psychiatrist who had a late onset of schizophrenia. He became homeless. He started to recycle through our criminal justice system, and he ended up in my courtroom where he had a full-blown psychotic episode that was very disturbing to everybody. And it turned out, because of the way the laws were set up in Florida at the time, I had very little authority and jurisdiction to be able to do much for him because he had only committed a nonviolent misdemeanor type offense. I learned 3 very serious lessons as a result of this incident. I learned that Miami-Dade County, as it turns out, has the largest percentage of people with serious mental illnesses of any urban area in the United States. It's almost 3 times the national average. 9.1% of my general population in Miami-Dade lives and suffers with a very serious mental illness. That's about 197,000 adults and 55,000 children. Only about 1% of that population actually gets services through the public mental health system. About 35% of our inmates at the time in our local jail had a serious mental illness. We were spending $500,000 a day. That's almost $180 million annually to warehouse people in conditions that you would cry if you saw this video. 3.5 of our 9 floors of our main jail had become mental health floors. And because conditions are not conducive in any jail in the United States for people with mental illnesses, they generally stay 4 to 8 times longer than someone without a mental illness for the exact same charge at about 7 times the cost. And at the time, because we had done so little to train our police officers on how to deal with these issues, we had more than 25 people with serious mental illnesses die during an encounter with a police officer because the law enforcement officer didn't know how to handle the situation. That was the first lesson I learned as a result of this case. The second lesson I learned is this was not just a local problem, but it turned out to be a state and national one as well. And the third lesson, and maybe the more difficult lesson, is that our community mental health systems in this country and our crisis system and laws, they are antiquated, they are fragmented, they are painfully under-resourced, and they do not necessarily use the evidence-based practices that we know that actually work. And so people don't get the services that they need, and they end up in the criminal system as a default. You know, I've been doing this for about 18 years, and I've come to a very simple conclusion that if we treated people with primary health issues the way we treated people with serious mental illnesses in this country, not only would there be a plethora of civil lawsuits against providers, there would probably be indictments for gross negligence. I do not understand why we have sat so silently for so long. We discharge people in the middle of the night, usually half psychotic, from facilities. We don't provide them with the services that they need, and then we are surprised they end up in the criminal justice system. Because this isn't a criminal justice problem. This is a community mental health problem. And that's what really needs to be fixed. So let's talk about how this can be fixed, how it should be fixed. There is a national initiative going on. If you haven't heard about it, you need to look it up. It's called Stepping Up. It's a collaboration between the National Association of Counties, the Council of State Governments, and the American Psychiatric Association Foundation. We have had about 450 counties representing almost half the American population pass resolutions getting involved in this initiative. And what we are doing is teaching counties how to reduce the overrepresentation of people with mental illnesses in their criminal justice system. Now, we began our initiative in Miami in 2000 after I had this terrible situation with this psychiatrist. I will tell you it's good to be judge because when we invite people to meetings, they generally come even if they don't want to be there. And so we had this 2-day event where we invited all the traditional and non-traditional stakeholders to sit down and talk about this issue because you have to understand the criminal justice system is an adversarial system. We purposely, constitutionally, and appropriately aren't supposed to be chummy with the lawyers and the prosecutors and the defenders, because you need to leave some objectivity between you when you're fighting over very serious issues. Often liberty, and in my state, could be death. And so it's odd for us to actually sit down and talk, but this is one of the few areas, and my Supreme Court has actually given us the green light to do this, and so have all the Chief Justices of all the state Supreme Courts speak through a resolution we had passed asking the courts to actually intervene and start to get involved in this issue. Because we need the kind of leadership to bring these different parties together to try to fix it. So in 2000, we had this 2-day summit, and the first thing we did is we literally mapped out on walls, on paper, how the criminal justice system intersected with the community mental health system in our community. And what we found basically is that it didn't, that we were embarrassingly dysfunctional. We were actually part of the problem, not part of the solution. I'll give you a classic example. It's what happened with that psychiatrist. Someone would commit a low-level quality of life offense. They'd be arrested. They'd sit in jail a longer period of time than anybody else. They had not only bond, they just didn't even know how to access bond or pretrial because of their illnesses. They'd finally come in front of a judge. They would generally get credit for time served after we ordered all these expensive evaluations because we would find them incompetent to stand trial. We had no competency restoration system for misdemeanors, so we would release them back to the street where they would end up just recycling again and again and again. And so we brought all these different parties together in the room. And there's nothing nefarious going on here, although I think with some of the bondsmen there may be, because they give a lot of contributions to state legislators to fight some of the initiatives that you've heard about. But in our system, when it comes to people with mental illness, it's just a bizarre system where you have the far left and the far right in some weird ways have inexplicably and not intentionally conspired to make the situation worse. And so, having said that, what we realized through this summit is that the police were policing, the judges were judging, the prosecutors prosecuting, the defenders defending, and there wasn't one entity that was accountable or responsible for these very, very sick people. And so they were just recycling and accessing all of these very expensive services for everybody in the room. I remember vividly all of us looking at each other at one point at this event and saying, who's more sick? These people that have a diagnosable, very serious illness that didn't ask to be ill, or us so-called policymakers that have developed policies that are flat out dangerous, inappropriate, expensive, and hurting people. And so as a result of this event, we mapped out our system. We produced a series of goals. We did it in mind with something that they had done in Seattle. In Seattle, they had an event out there, and they took a room full of folks like you and me to a local park. And they took their shoes and their purses and their wallets and their IDs away from them. And they said, okay, you have a serious mental illness. Tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock, you need to be in court. At 10:30, you need to go see your probation officer. At 1 o'clock, you have an appointment with your psychiatrist. And at 3 o'clock, you need to go pick up your medication. And if you think about it, we've created a system 9 to 5, 5 days a week for people that are really well and sophisticated, have cars and transportation, and can access systems. We didn't create a system for people that are really sick. And so we said, you know what? We need to create a system that works for people that are well. And so we looked at what we were doing to stem the flow of people with serious mental illnesses coming into our system. And once they came into and penetrated our system, how do we reverse that trend? So we looked around the country, and by far the best system in the country that we saw on the police side was a program that came out of Memphis, Tennessee, called Crisis Intervention Team Policing, CIT. It's a 40-hour training program where law enforcement are actually trained on how to identify people who are in crisis, how to de-escalate a situation, and where to take the individual as opposed to arresting them. And I will tell you, it was a slow start. The last thing the law enforcement community wanted was some civilian judge like me telling them how to do their job. I vividly remember going to see, we don't have a sheriff, we have a director in Miami-Dade, but that's our largest department. And I went to see him, and I was selling him or trying to sell him on this CIT concept, which we had just started. And he was incredibly condescending. I almost felt like he was patting me on the head. And he said, Judge, I appreciate you coming. We did all this analysis, and we ran all the data. And last year in Dade County, we're like the 4th largest community in the country, we only had 3 mental health calls. 3. And I'm not exaggerating. I said, well, Director, I appreciate you doing that, but these calls don't come in as a mental health call. They come in as domestic violence, vagrancy, there's all kinds of things. Well, suffice to say, they now have the largest CIT program after this report that was in the news and after the grand jury basically indicted that department for not doing this because they were shooting about 1 person a week with a serious mental illness. And now they have, because they keep data, about 5,700 mental health calls a year. And so part of it is identifying the issue. We now have the largest trained squad of CIT officers in the country. All 36 police departments in Miami-Dade County are trained. We have over 6,000 officers trained. The city of Miami and Miami-Dade, which are our 2 largest police departments out of the 36, keep data on every single mental health call. Over the last 8 years, combined, those 2 police departments handled 83,427 mental health calls. And more impressively and more importantly, out of the 83,427 calls that were made, they only made 149 arrests. Police shootings almost stopped. Police injuries almost stopped. The number of arrests in Dade County went from 118,000 a year when we started to 56,000 this year. Our jail audit has been cut almost in half. And all of this, and much of this is due to all of these system changes that we have made. We also discovered another unintended issue that shocked us, and it was the level of PTSD among our police officers. In fact, our CIT coordinator receives 150 calls a month from police officers for their own personal mental health issues. So that same little pituitary gland I talked to you about at the beginning, police officers have the exact same pituitary gland. And they can't run away from traumatic situations when somebody may be shooting at them or they go to a scene that is violent and horrible. They have to stay and deal with it. And they're in one of the worst professions in the country to talk about it. So they don't go for help. It explains why last year more police officers committed suicide than died in the line of duty. It explains why they have some of the highest divorce rates, substance use rates, and domestic violence rates, and suicide rates of any profession because of the PTSD. These illnesses do not discriminate. But because we have opened a line of communication with them, we actually set up a separate area for them to get treated outside their departments because they do not want to go to their departments for help. And so they love what we are doing. They have become incredibly empathetic. And now you are the cool officer if you get pushed or punched or hit by someone with mental illness and don't make the arrest. And you're the wimpy officer if you arrest somebody with a mental illness if you get pushed or touched. The whole culture has shifted because we have helped address their issue as well. We also set up 3 post-arrest diversion programs as well. Now, if you get arrested on a misdemeanor in Dade County, we stopped ordering all these ridiculously expensive evaluations that served absolutely no purpose. We have you screened at the jail. We changed the jail screening to use a validated tool so that the individuals are getting identified appropriately. And if you're arrested on a misdemeanor with a serious mental illness in Dade County, within 3 days of your arrest, you are transferred from the jail. You are taken to one of our crisis stabilization units. One of our staff members goes to see you while you're there. Because they're on a criminal hold and not a civil hold, we reset the case in about 2 weeks, which is what they really need for stabilization, not 3 days. They're given the opportunity to come into our program. If they accept, which most of them do, they do not go back to jail. They get transported directly to the courtroom. And when they get to the courtroom, there is a peer specialist waiting for them. We have 8 peers. Those are people with serious mental illnesses. 4 of them are graduates of our program. They have lived experience. Some of them have schizophrenia, bipolar, major depression, trauma, and they are in full recovery. They are amazing human beings. They help these individuals reestablish relationships, because what we find is that so many of these individuals at the time of their arrest have clinical depression on top of their mental illness. It's not that you just have to give them a pill and they're going to be fine. They've given up on life. Our systems have beaten the living crap out of them. They just don't care anymore. And so the peers help reestablish relationships to get them incentivized to want to start to get better. We have a car from the county. We transport them where they need to go. We get them benefits. We get them housing. We get them clothes. We get them medication. We monitor them. And guess what happened? Our recidivism rate of our misdemeanor population went from 72% to 20%, because treatment works. And people want to get better. People don't want to be sick. They generally don't want to be out in the street. The program worked so well, our state attorney allowed us to expand it to felony cases, which we now do. Our felony program, which deals with nonviolent felons, similar type of program, has saved the county 68 years in jail bed days just over the last 6 years, because people aren't coming back into the system. We now have another program going on restoration, another diversion program, also incredibly effective. I don't have any more time to talk about it, but one of the big vexing problems in this country, in the little world that I work in, is something called competency restoration. It is ripe for research and reporting. Our counties, our states are spending billions, not millions of dollars, to restore people so that we can give them credit time server, have their charges dropped, and kick them back to the street without services. There's a wonderful piece Samantha Bee did on it. You can Google Samantha Bee, Florida Competency Restoration, and you'll see how asinine the whole system is, and it really needs to be reformed as well. The bottom line is that with good systems of care, helping people access treatment, you can make a significant difference in this situation and really help turn this problem around. Thank you all very, very much, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you, Judge. Before I open it up for questions, I have a question, and all three of you can think about a response to this if you wish. If I'm a journalist and I'm looking at how do I approach the system, where are the pressure points, I go back to something you said, Judge, which is you're the gatekeeper. Does this start with the judge and trickle down, or prosecution has a lot of discretion in certain things? Is there an active defense bar? What about community pressure? Judges are elected. What about community pressure on police officers to make arrests? Where do you sort of start?
You know, I think what you realize, I've been on the bench almost 21 years at this point, and sadly, the criminal justice system is a repository for failed public policy. We don't cause these problems. We are dealing with these problems that come to us. So just pointing fingers at our system isn't necessarily going to fix it. Just blaming the police for shootings, just doing those kinds of things do not necessarily help. These issues are more complicated. So for instance, I've come to the conclusion that while race certainly can and often plays a role in police shootings, I think PTSD among law enforcement plays a much greater role. And no one's talking about that. And we should be getting our law enforcement officers treated and having access to treatment, and you would see your shootings go down. But I think really what this is about is looking at the system problem. And why are all these individuals with serious mental illnesses coming into the system? And it's because our community mental health systems were designed and developed when most people in this country were still in state hospitals. You know, in 1955, there were some 550,000 people in state hospitals around the United States, state civil psychiatric hospitals. Today, there's about 30,000 beds left. If we had continued to have state hospitals, and I'm not advocating it at all because you don't need them, but just to put it in context, if our population had continued to grow the way that it did, you'd have about 1.5 million people with serious mental illnesses in state hospitals today. Well, last year, while there were 2 million arrests of people with mental illnesses, it was 1.5 million people. It was almost the exact amount of people. So we never deinstitutionalized. What we did is we transferred responsibility from those crappy hospitals to the crappy jail. And so the state, the community mental health system never got funded the way it was supposed to get funded. And it was never designed for the most acutely ill. And so we've taken this whole population and they hit a buzzsaw. You had major cuts in housing. You had a war on crime, war on drugs, and closed state hospitals and a community system that wasn't designed to treat them. And so what we need to do is look at that part of the system. And if there's any blame to go around, it's that we have not treated these mental illnesses as real illnesses and funded them in ways that we do primary health issues. And so we really need to restructure the community mental health system, and it has to be better designed to handle people that are more acutely ill.
Thank you. You want to address that?
Sure. So the question is about pressure points. I think it varies, and I think what good journalism will do is sort of begin by asking a lot of questions of the sort of the state of pretrial justice within your local jurisdiction. And I guarantee you, if you begin to try to get interviews with whoever's in public defense, the prosecutor, the sheriff, a judge, you'll eventually find somebody who has been to some conference, some meeting, read something somewhere, who's beginning to understand that there might be an issue locally and can probably help you and point you in the direction of kind of where to look. I think we have seen, in terms of putting what you would consider pressure on a local system to begin to look and make improvements, is that there's really no wrong door. Some of this is being spurred by legislation, some is being spurred by litigation, some is being spurred by community groups who are, beginning to become aware that there are alternatives and their jurisdictions are simply not using it. One of the kind of things that we've known from public opinion polling over the last 5 years is that most people are unaware of these issues. So your general readership is completely unaware, as Chris, of these issues. But the good news is when they become aware and then get educated only slightly. I mean, we're talking about during the course of a public opinion poll, coming back to them at the end of the poll of 20 minutes later saying, now that you've actually heard some stuff, and we've talked a little bit about this stuff, do you has your opinion changed? And with very little education, people are moving from, I had never thought about this system before, to why the hell do we do it this way? And we want alternatives to the way in which we're doing things today. So I think you can find those pressure points, you can exploit them, and you can really do a service to your community right just from the very beginning and just explain the way things are working and the outcomes we're getting.
Just real quick, the criminal justice system is not an innovative system. I mean, it's designed to handle masses amount of people as equitably as possible, the same way, whether you're in Seattle or Miami. And so innovation often comes by the outside to us. And it's not as nefarious as people necessarily think. You have young lawyers coming in, they get trained to do things a certain way, so they don't ask questions like, why are we setting bail on this? It's almost because this is what we do. And so we need to be educated as well that we're possibly doing it the wrong way, and journalism plays a critical role in doing that. Florida is unique in that the grand jury system not only indicts people for capital offenses, but they actually do grand jury reports on major social issues in our communities. And so when this reporter, and this doesn't happen anymore, her first two pieces were 11 and 12 minutes on the 6 and 11 o'clock news. It's unheard of, 2 nights in a row. And overnight, she changed the entire dynamic. And fortuitously, the grand jury was getting impaneled like 3-4 weeks later, and they were asked, what issue do you want to look into? And they said the overcriminalization of people with mental illnesses. And this report just was this amazing, enlightening piece of work that came out of a journalist's, desire of the horrors that were going on in our jail. Otherwise, it probably would not have grown the way it has grown and allowed us to make such structural changes in our own community to fix it.
I think the one thing I add is that there's, of course, a temptation to point to the underlying social drivers, whether it's drugs or mental illness, or point to the stakeholders who are varied, whether the prosecutors, the judges, the police. But as the judge was alluding to, the underlying problem isn't a social problem; it's a policy problem. Places are choosing to build larger jails, and then they fill them. And right now, there's just dozens and dozens of places across the country that are contemplating small rural places, $20 million new jails, and they think this is solving the problem. And it's about reframing what the jail is used for and having a broader conversation about how we ought to be spending our money. Someone that I think was Cherise mentioned, maybe it was a judge, it's do we pick a jail or do we pick a mental health facility? They aren't offered that choice. The jail is put up for a vote, and that's it. It's not like we could do, a school expansion, or we could do mental health, or we could do a new jail. It's just jail.
And I'll tell you, the privatization of prison scares the hell out of me, because then you're going to have a financial incentive that has access to legislators to build more. And so we have to really think this stuff through and look at the ramifications of where we're going.
I do think I agree with you talk about the war on drugs. There seemed, starting in the 70s, 80s, to me, as someone who's covered criminal justice, that what we've seen is an approach meaning that we're going to let the courts solve our social problems. So we're just going to shove it all into the jurisprudence area.
We did a great job, didn't we?
And now this is the residue of we have full jails, we have full prisons, we have, and it's not creating, it's not making anything better, it seems to me. I'd like to open for your questions, I'm sure.
Okay, I'll come around with the mic.
And say who you are, and so where you're from, and...
Hi. My foot's asleep, I'm sorry. I'm Whitney with KUER in Salt Lake City. I had a question for Cherise. You were talking a little bit earlier about the concentration of finding where the concentration of money bond is in your jurisdiction. How do we go about finding something like that?
Right. By law, there are supposed to be reports filed, depending on what the name of your insurance regulatory system is in your state. There are supposed to be reports filed by the commercial surety industry. So there are really kind of two ways you can find out this data. One is to try to go through the insurance department reports to see where these bonds are being written in your state. The other is to try to go to the court system and get data on at least the setting of the money bond. Often courts are very poor at keeping data on who actually makes that bond amount. But all of this should be within sort of the open records request that you can do, or in straight dialogue if you have a system stakeholder who will help you get that data. So either go to the courts and see where money bond, who's having money bonds set. And in Maryland, it might be good to look at the Maryland report that was completed. A lot of this stuff is also done in Maryland. We have an amazing public defender, a chief public defender for the state, and he has actual research capacity within his state office. And so often you can also go to the public defenders and ask these questions of them.
Next question. I'll come around.
Hi, I'm Deborah Berry with USA Today in the Washington Bureau. I know there's many proposals out there for criminal justice reforms on the national level, congressional level. Are there any that address enough of these issues for you? And particularly since there are local issues as well, are there enough state legislators or lawmakers that are doing enough to address either a piece of this whole issue?
Yes. It's starting, and it's fascinating to see, the Koch brothers teaming up with the ACLU on smart justice initiatives, and that's encouraging. And I think what's happened is it's just costing too much money for legislators to continue the way we're going, and so even the most ardent conservatives don't want to keep spending these dollars the way they're doing because the outcomes are terrible. It's much more economically feasible with much better criminal justice outcomes to provide treatment for people, at least in my area, than it is to incarcerate them. We also know that a day in jail for someone with serious mental illness is re-traumatizing, often makes their illness worse, and puts them in a worse shape when they come out. If they had employment, which is usually not very often, they lose that employment. If they had housing, they lose that housing, and they are more likely to recycle through our system. So there is a good change on the way. I'm seeing a lot of initiatives which are encouraging, but we need to get there faster. And again, I would encourage you to look at the Stepping Up initiative, which is one of the biggest national issues, at least on the mental health system.
And with respect to bail reform, there's a couple of resources that you can look to. So this is mostly a state legislature issue. There is a piece of federal legislation called the Pretrial Integrity and Safety Act, which was introduced by Rand Paul and Kamala Harris. But that's just to provide grant money to states to sort of bribe them to do the right thing. We really have had to go state by state. What we've done for the first 35 years of this reform was go county by county and try to work with individual counties to change the way they conducted their local bail practices. Even in the best of jurisdictions, they would bump up against whatever the state statute required, and Florida is one of the worst in terms of bail statutes that are codified, dollar amounts codified in the bail statute of the state. So even if a judge wanted to do something different, he or she cannot because it's in state statute. So for 25 years, in the 80s and 90s, when no one was paying attention to the bail issue in America, the American Legislative Exchange Council was. The bondsman ran the Public Safety and Elections Committee. Why those two things are together, I don't know, or they used to be together. And got a lot of state houses to pass bail measures that applied money bond to almost everything, that eliminated liability for the bondsman. So now, even in jurisdictions, state statute says that if Maurice fails to appear, I have, as the bondswoman who wrote his bond, I don't have to pay the court anything on that for like 2 years. And during those 2 years, he's going to get picked up by law enforcement on a warrant for his for failing to appear. So we have to use that same mechanism, right, that the bondsmen have used to eradicate liability and to move money bond into this country, to use those same statutes. In our Where Pretrial Improvements Are Happening document that we publish quarterly, you'll see a compendium of state statutes or state legislation, excuse me. The National Conference of State Legislatures also has a database online that you may be familiar with. But if you want to know the statutes in your state, go to the National Conference of State Legislature and just Google pretrial or bail laws, and it will give you a digestion of not only the existing state statutes, but if there were like 35 states this year that had houses that were considering legislation in this area. So it's coming. The problem with it is this, my last thing. I sort of was quoted as calling it tepid tea. So we've seen a lot of overeager legislators say, oh, bail reform is the new, pretrial reform is the new thing. Let me introduce a piece of legislation on bail reform. But if you dig into it, like anyone from Connecticut? In Connecticut, they passed a piece of bail legislation. Everyone was like, congratulations. But if you drilled into how many people in the state it would impact, it's like a couple hundred. So I don't want those bills passed, right? I would rather see sort of tepid bills not get passed so that we can come back with actual legislation that will make an impact on a majority of people.
And don't you have no validated screening tools that are really effective on release that show that? Do you like this?
So I like some. I like some tools. I don't like other tools. I think anything that if you're in a jurisdiction that uses a proprietary tool owned by a company that charges your jurisdiction for the licensing and training and doesn't allow you to see the actual algorithm or the way in which the tools are calculated, those are bad tools. Bad is a scientific label. Bad. I like some tools, not all tools. And we have a document that sort of goes through how you should be assessing the risk assessment tool that your jurisdiction is using.
Every time that you see an article about someone who is on bail and then commits a horrible crime, has to be a setback to some degree. I mean, I can't tell you the number of actual policy changes and laws in the state of Illinois that were the result of this type of situation. Whether it was someone who committed a crime while they were out on bail, or someone who was the 12-year-old who is accused of murdering someone. So now we have to be able to charge people as young as 10 as adults. How do you deal with those kind of situations? As a judge, sort of the buck stops there, right?
The way that I usually frame that issue is that, at least in the mental health side, that if you don't provide people treatment, the risk goes much higher. 98, 99% of people with mental illnesses that get arrested are released. They're not committing heinous offenses and going to prison for life. And so the better argument to me is if you do the traditional system of trying and incarcerating people, you're actually making and threatening the public safety worse, because they're getting out, and they're going to get out in worse shape than when they went in. But if you provide them diversion and treatment, the chances of them reoffending go way, way down. Their risks go way, way down, and they become, contributing members of society. Look, I'm knock on wood, but we've been doing this, our program's around 18 years, and we haven't had any, I probably just jinxed it. I'm not going to be able to go home after today, but we have not had a problem in 18 years, and we've diverted tens of thousands of people from our system. There hasn't been one heinous offense where someone's gone out that we released, because we're monitoring them, they're on medication, they're getting housing, they're getting treated, and they're doing substantially better. If we didn't do that, the chances of them reoffending is much, much greater.
There's a little bit of a leap of faith at the beginning, though, right?
There is, and you have to educate a lot of people. That's why we started very, very slow by just doing, and it's a misnomer, we were doing nonviolent misdemeanors, but the charge shouldn't really matter. I mean, just the charge is irrelevant. I could have someone charged with a serious felony that wouldn't hurt a lamb, and I could have someone charged with a nonviolent misdemeanor that's incredibly dangerous. But the system is set up the way it is that people think, if it's nonviolent offense, I should, get them treated. So it's a big education system.
Hi, I'm Whitney. I'm the Whitney from Mississippi. And we have a local judge who is very sympathetic to prisoners with mental illness being incarcerated for low-level offenses, and he's trying to start a pretrial diversion program, and he has it all set up. He's already got the system, but they just need the funding to do it. The state won't give it, and he's trying to look for grants. How did you get that funding secured in the first place, or convince your legislatures to give that funding?
Yeah. We started with no money and no resources. I was embarrassed to ask my county for any money at first, because we were part of the problem. We were spending in the court about $1.5 million to $2 million a year on psychological evaluations for misdemeanors so that they could be released back to the street. So we already had existing mental health providers. I didn't need any initial dollars, to be honest with you. I just learned how to access what was already existing. And so I don't know if he's in a rural community in Mississippi, and so there may not be a mental health provider there, but there must be some mental health provisions somewhere in the state that he might be able to access. If not, what he may want to do, or she, is talk to the local county government. And that's part of the problem. There's 3,000 counties, 80% of the solutions at the local level. And so you have to, it's hard making the kind of shifts that you need to do. There's not a switch that we can flip that fixes this. The feds in the state are primarily responsible for financing treatment. They're not responsible for the systems of care. Those are localized. And that's why this is such a difficult problem to fix. But afterwards, I'll be happy to give you my card for the judge. We have a national initiative called the Judges Psychiatric Leadership Initiative, and it's through the American Psychiatric Association Foundation and the Council of State Governments. And we go to states and we teach judges how to do this and help them with where to find funding. But there may be resources through the Justice Department and some other resources I can give you.
Hi, I'm Paul from the Keene Sentinel in Southwest New Hampshire. Our state just passed a bail reform law that doesn't do away with money bond, but it says no one should be held pretrial just because of their financial condition. This goes into effect in 2 months, and I'm wondering sort of what metrics in the next 6 to 12 months I should be looking at to see has this been a success or not.
Great question. So the reference he's making is to a bit of a wave of reform in the bail reform movement that sort of focuses on ability to pay. Politically, it seems to be a little more palpable to people. Just like we have empathy for people with mental illness, we have, it's like socially acceptable to have empathy for people who are poor or working class. And so these ability to pay determinations are kind of also part of the settlement that's happening in a lot of litigation across the country. So, are you raising your hand? Oh, for Steve, yeah. 90% of people in this country qualify for a public defender. You all know that, right? Most people are not walking into court with, these high-priced lawyers that you see on television. And so this notion is that how New Hampshire will implement ability to pay, I'm not quite exactly sure, but these are some of the metrics that you could look at to see. So you're going to need some baseline measures to be able to determine whether or not you see an improvement in the detention of people who are essentially now, of course, I just want to say as a caveat, you wouldn't need an ability to pay determination if you actually just stopped setting money bond, right? But this is a workaround for some systems, right? To say, okay, well, we'll set the money bond, but we won't keep people in jail who are too poor to post it. So what you'll look to see is how many people prior to the implementation of this law were being held in jail on bond amounts that they could not afford to pay. Now, how are you going to decide whether or not those people could not afford to pay that bail amount that was set? Or some opponents to bail reform will say they could have afforded to pay that bond. They chose not to for a variety of reasons. 3 hots and a cot, priorities. I mean, some of your less enlightened colleagues across the country I have met in rural jurisdictions who've said, the defendant has tattoos and smokes. Don't tell me they can't afford to post bond.
Okay,
How sick is that, right? Or do they have cable TV? Well, if they have a satellite dish, then they can afford to post bond. So look to see how many people were in jail who were on bond amounts prior and who qualified for a public defender. That's going to be kind of your best proxy for whether or not they, quote, could have afforded bond. Because this determination of can you afford to post bond is typically made on some relationship to the federal poverty level. So in some of these litigation settlements, it's saying if you, are at or below 150% of the federal poverty level, then you can be qualified as sort of not able to pay. Policy is going to be in this gray area where the assertion is just above the poverty level or just above 100. So if you're 200% of the poverty level, you're asking people to choose between making rent, car payments, car insurance, school payments, whatever it is they're using their money for, and posting bond. So look to see some before and after measures related to maybe the use of public defender, or if they are having indigency determinations for public defender use, that data may be available prior to and post-implementation. What we'd prefer to see, right, is will that, and what I'd love to see a reporter look at in any place that's moving to an ability to pay determination, is anyone from Alabama here? Yeah. So, so in some of these places where lawsuits have happened, I'd like to be curious to see, are they actually reducing the use of money bond in the first place, not just using more ability to pay determinations?
Just to stay on schedule, we're going to take a short 15-minute break, but save your questions. I know our speakers are also here if you have some special questions, so just stand up and relax. We'll reconvene with our next panel in 15 minutes.
Thank you
But
all.
please
very
join me in
much.
thanking our panelists and our moderator.
Thanks, guys. This was great.